So I have the front of my wolf t-shirt as well as the back of my t-shirt that I'll be using to make a pair of size 2T baby joggers. These are the joggers I'll be using to make a pattern from. I'll fold them on their sides, and I will begin, and as well as the shirt will be folded on its side, and I will begin cutting out the pant pattern. I'm leaving a little bit of extra space, about a 1/2 inch extra for seam allowance. As I come around the bottom of the pants, I'm going to do about 1 inch seam allowance. Towards the top of the pants, I'm going to do about 1.5 inches seam allowance because I'll be adding in elastic, 1 inch elastic, so I need to have that extra 1/2 inch seam allowance. As I cut the sides, I'm also doing about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So 1/2 inch on the sides, 1 inch on the bottom, and 1.5 inch seam allowance on the top. Now, as you can see, I have my front and my back cut out at the same time. That's the front pant, and this is the back pant underneath. And what I'm going to do is fold the front back on its side so I can curve the front along the waistline, because the front is actually lower than the back along the waist. So I'm going to cut that curve. So I'm folding the pant in half, just so you can see the front is on a curve. So I'm going to cut my front on a curve as well, blending back into the side seam. Now I am placing my pants on the table with right sides together, meaning the correct sides on the inside, and the inside of the fabric is facing outward. I'm pretty much prepping this to sew it. Pin and sew. Next up, I'm going to measure and cut my cuffs. So I have my shirt folded twice so I can cut out my cuffs at the same time, and I doubled the height of the cuffs. So see, as you can see, I have 2 cuffs, and I'm folding them in half. Just so you have an idea of what they'll look like. Now that I have all my pieces cut out, I'm going to take all the pieces to the serger machine and just lightly serge the raw edges. And I'm also going to attach the original care label tag that was on my t-shirt. Now this step with the serger machine is completely optional if you have a serger machine. Serging is something you can do at this step, or you can do once the pants are done. Then you can take the pants to a serger machine and serge off the raw edges. Or if you don't have a serger, you can use the zigzag stitch on your home sewer machine. As you can see, I'm not really cutting any fabric away. I'm just finishing the raw edge. Here I'm adding in the tag, so it's already included, which is pretty cool. You don't have to order tags or, design a care label. You can just use the original care label that was on the product. When you get to a curve, just fold your fabric in a way that your fabric is still lined up on the serger machine. And continue serging until it's completed. Now I'm just clipping all my serger threads that were hanging. And as you can see, my tag is attached with the care labels on the underside. Now the front and the back are completely serged, as well as the cuffs. And I cut and serged some additional pocket pieces just in case I want to add pockets to these pants. Again, pockets are optional. These are both pairs of my cuffs. And as you can see, everything is serged and ready to be sewn. First thing I'm going to do is sew my front pant to my back pant. Now before I sew my front to my back, I'm just marking my waistband area because I'm gonna do an actual opening on the waistband to pull the drawstring through. So I'm doing an elastic waistband with a drawstring. Now the drawstring is optional. You can do a buttonhole at the top and actually create a buttonhole opening to pull the drawstring through, or you can do a mock buttonhole or a mock drawstring where you just attach the string to the front by stitching it in place. Here I am sewing my buttonhole. The sides of my pant are already marked as far as where the waistband is gonna go later as far as the elastic. And here I'm just sewing the buttonhole, and I go around a couple of times so that the thread is nice and thick. Then I fold the pants in half again so that I can cut the little opening for the buttonhole. Again, I'm slitting. I'm careful not to clip the threads that I just sewed. And now my buttonhole is complete. Next up, I'm just gonna sew my cuffs. So with my cuffs folded sideways, I'm stitching down at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I have my magnet on standby, so as I pull my pins out, I have somewhere to place my pins. I will repeat the process for the other cuff as well. I'm clipping my threads, and after that, I can now fold it down in half, and voila, I have cuffs. Now, with my front and back pinned together, the good sides on the inside, I'm going to sew down on the sides at a 1/2 inch seam allowance from the top and bottom, and then on the inseam, I'm going to sew it as well at a 1/2 inch. Again, my fabric, I'm making sure that my edges are lined up at the 1/2 inch mark along my measuring plate on the sewing machine. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and end of each stitch. By backstitching, you lock your stitch in and prevent your threads from unraveling. Now I'm going to go to the other side, or the other side seam, and I'm going to repeat the process, lining it up to a 1/2 inch, come forward a few steps, backstitch, and then come forward at a 1/2 inch seam allowance the entire time. And I will sew straight down and backstitch at the end as well. Again, my magnet is on standby to collect my pins. Backstitch, come forward, and now the sides are done. The next thing to sew is the inseam. I also have a trash can underneath my table, so as I clip my threads, I can quickly throw them away. Remember to backstitch or reverse. Again, the inseam is at a 1/2 inch seam allowance as well. Clipping my threads, and now I'm going to make sure all my threads are clipped. Also note how my tag is attached on the side. And now we are ready for the cuffs. Before we get to the cuffs, I almost forgot. Clip your seam allowance in the curved area on your inseam. The reason being is it reduces the tension. Whenever you sew something on a curve, the fabric gets really tight and tense. So to ease that, please do light snips in the seam allowance only. Try not to clip the line that you just sewed. Now you can turn the pants right side out. Note how smooth and flat the crotch area looks. That's because I clipped inside the seam allowance. Now I am placing my cuffs onto the bottom of my pant, and I'm matching up the edges, the edge of the cuff and the edge of the pants. And I'm pinning, and I'm going to sew it all around. I know I have an inch seam allowance, but I'm only going to sew it at a 1/2 inch, just to give the pants more room in the leg area. So I'm just going around in a circle and placing some pins. The next step is to sew it on the sewing machine. Line up the edge to a 1/2 inch seam allowance and start sewing. Remember to back stitch in the beginning and the end. Remember to take your pins out as you go. If you don't, your needle can accidentally hit a pin and it can break the tip off your needle. It also could jam your machine. I'm flattening out my seam allowance flaps as I go. I make sure that they're open and flat. By opening my seam allowance flaps as I go, it reduces the amount of layers I have to sew over, so it doesn't look as bulky. As you can see, it's all attached, and I'm going to flip it down now. And of course I will press it later. But now I have an attached cuff. I'm going to repeat the process with the other cuff. Now next is the waistband. So I'm going to measure the front and back of the original pants and just double that number to get the full length of my waistband. And then I'll also leave about an inch extra so that I can put the edges together and sew it at a 1/2 inch. So it's the waist plus 1 inch, and then put the right sides together and sew it at a 1/2 inch. I'm gonna put the machine on the stretch stitch because I'm sewing elastic. So be sure to switch your stitch to stretch when sewing elastic, because if not, your machine will jam. Now I'm trimming down my elastic a little bit. And clipping my threads. And now I have my elastic waistband that I will be adding in at the waist area. I also opened up my flaps and did 2 little straight stitches to keep them open so that it's less bulky where the seam allowance is. Now I have snips in my waistband. little markings of so I know where to pin the elastic. And now I can fold the extra down over the elastic and pin it. And I like to pin at each side seam first. So now I'm pinning the other side seam, repeating the process again. Fold down over. Now the part that I'm folding down is about 1.5 inches, and my elastic is only 1 inch. But the part that folds down, you always want it to be longer than the elastic. Now I'm going to pin the center of the front and the center of the back. To do this, I have to stretch the elastic until the fabric is flat, and then pin the center. I'm finding the center of my middle, so I make sure that it is correctly pinned. Now I'm going to start sewing, and I'm going to sew at about 1.25 inches seam allowance. I'm also pulling it as I go, because you want to make sure that your fabric is flat and straight. So you have to pull the elastic to make sure that your waistband, it's flat and it's straight. Take your time on this. Remember your seam allowance. Also, make sure that your stitch is on stretch stitch right now. Currently my machine is on stretch stitch. When it's on stretch stitch, you do not have to reverse at the beginning or end. You can just start sewing. But remember to keep pulling your fabric as you go to make sure it's flat. Don't worry, it'll snap back in the end because of the elastic. As you can see, the area that I already started sewing, it snaps back and it has a nice like gathering effect. Again, take your time when sewing the waistband. The next thing to do once you're done sewing your waistband is to pull the drawstring through. Now this string was originally too long, so I cut it and I tied a knot, and I'm gonna use a safety pin to pull the drawstring through the pant, and I'm gonna insert it through the buttonhole opening. Again, if you choose not to pull the drawstring through and you just want to do a mock drawstring, you don't even have to sew a buttonhole. You can leave it shut and you can just attach the drawstring to the front of the pant just using a little straight stitch and then tying it in a bow tie, and it looks like a real drawstring. But here I'm using the safety pin to pull it through. As you can see, I finished. And I did like a top knot at the waist, and then I knotted the bottom of each string. This is also an old shoestring, which I decided to use because the tips of the shoestring were already finished. Next is to pin in the pockets on either side. As you can see, I have one pair already done for you to see. I measured down about 3 inches and I believe 3/8 of an inch, so it's 3 3/8 of an inch. And then I pin my pocket in. And now I'm going to show you how I did that. So I measured 3 3/8 down from the waist, from the top of the pant. I also found the middle of my pocket and pinned that. And then I am folding under my serged edges all the way around. I'm also taking my time with this because I'm making sure I only pin this top layer and I don't grab the other layers of the pant. So just keep checking because I'd hate for you to pin the entire pocket in and then it's pinned all the way through and you have to undo it. So take your time. Now the pockets are optional. The original pants did not have pockets. But I wanted to use as much of my fabric as I could because this is a t-shirt that I had for years that I really absolutely loved. So I wanted to make sure I used as much of it as I could. The next step is to sew the pocket. Now, I sewed it at 1/8 seam allowance all the way around. Of course, I backstitched in the beginning and the end. You can put your machine back on regular stitch at this point. There are many different ways to sew a pocket on. In this case, I folded under the seam allowance and I top stitched. But you could also do a zigzag stitch if you want, or you could opt to not do pockets at all. Again, I'm sewing at 1/8 inch seam allowance, which is a stitch that falls right along the edge, the folded edge of the pocket. Remember, do not stitch the top of the pocket because that's the opening. And done. You will repeat the process for the other side as well. Clip the threads, and that is your finished product. Now time to do the other pocket. Now what we have is the finished pants, and this is, I already pressed it, but to show you how I did it, you want to make sure your iron is on the appropriate setting for whatever your fabric is. Mine is cotton, so it's on the cotton setting. And I'm pretty much just steaming over the pant to flatten out the pockets. I'm also steaming in the cuff area because the cuff area is a little bulky because of the seam allowance, but you could also trim down the seam allowance. And now this is the finished product. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video.